Hey, what's going on, Paul? I cannot hear your audio. I think I'm mute, Paul.
I was just trying to get signed in under the right Zoom account.
Cool.
Hi, everyone.
All right, we'll give it a few for folks to join.
Hello.
Hey.
Okay, Valerie has the main item on the agenda, so let's just give her a few.
I had some issues getting to GitHub to be able to get to the agenda to be able to get to the link. So she may be facing some
GitHub is not happy right now.
Ah, there she is.
Yeah, here I am.
Nice entrance. All right. Valerie, I think you've got the main agenda item today. It's probably worth seeing if there's other stuff on the agenda before we get started on that. Let's see. Okay, it's all you, Valerie. Go for it.
Okay. I don't have a huge update because the last week has been far more chaotic than I expected, but I have a basic reconciler portion prototyped out. The way it works right now is it just gets a whole bundle of YAML from some source that's meant to represent the entire cluster state, and then it does CRUD operations to line it up with anything that has an annotation. There's a couple changes after talking with Paul and David that I think I've made to that model, such as making the remote API a little bit more advanced to track individual item state. So rather than trying to sync and garbage collect the whole cluster, you would have an inventory of what each bundle or package used to contain, what needs to be explicitly deleted. Sorry, losing my train of thought here.
Valerie, the prototype that you have for the reconciler was pretty concise. David, you've seen the same code. Like, do we think it's worth just giving folks a tour? I think we could probably do that in 10 to 15 minutes if you're up for it.
I'd give her the option if she wanted. Otherwise, I think trying to describe some of the edge cases that you hit when you're doing this.
Sure.
So, because like I can see some that I've hit firsthand, right, where I'm creating a namespace and I'm creating resources in there, and like if you're unlucky, you can race against like cache as an admission. And so I wasn't sure whether you'd hit some of those challenges yet or not.
I haven't yet, but mostly I've only been reconciling fairly simple demos. So there are an unfortunate number of edge cases. The first thing that I've observed is the problem of intent, which is similar to what the server-side apply hits. Essentially, there's some fields that get set by admission or machinery or something that it's hard to tell whether or not a user is intending to wipe them, such as like the IP on a service or the number of replicas on something that an HPA manages. Initially, like I just do a straight up update operation rather than trying to use server-side apply, but I'm starting to wonder if server-side apply is a better approach.
Yeah, that's a really, that's definitely like, it does feel like we're hitting, because when I started playing with it, I hit the problem of the secret already exists, but it's of a different type. And so you can't update a type. That's an immutable thing. So like the update doesn't work, and the only way to fix it, I think, is to delete the secret and recreate it. And have you found some things like that too? Like, I don't know how many of those we're going to bump.
Yeah, I haven't directly hit that, but I've thought about it. That might have to be a dynamic thing rather than trying to program in what to expect from every type. Like make it understand that if it has a conflict like that, then it has to just turn it into a delete create operation.
I'm trying to remember if OpenAPI schema holds any information about which fields are immutable. Anybody know off the top of their head?
Yeah, I don't know that it does today. I know that Stefan has a cap out there about trying to describe immutable fields, but there's a lot of edges around immutability. Some people want like set once fields. So it is a complicated space. When you were looking, had you found, so today, I don't think we have a client yet from API Machinery for actually using server-side apply. Which,
I don't believe so, no.
yeah. So I'll say that some of these bumps that you're hitting, I knew where to look, so I was able to like look at it and play with it. And I found out about these bumps because Jordan and I hit them. About a year and change ago, we hit similar problems, and we weren't able to find a way to solve them generically. What we ended up doing is like, we know certain types, and then we have some of the types that we know, like a secret. For instance, we know the secret behavior with what happens on secret type changes. And so we know that it has to be a delete and a recreate. We didn't really find a way around it.
Do you think that responding to that specific error with a automatic create and delete would be suitable, or do you think that would be a dangerous implementation?
I could see that getting hung up on if you have a type that's finalized, it may take considerably longer than you might think to delete a resource so that you can recreate it.
It does some wacky stuff. I'll say that. I think that like one of the outcomes of this, when we eventually read it up in more detail, after we get through some more prototyping stuff, I think we may end up having to break it down into crazy things that we're able to do with our own internal types. And I blame Tim for services, for instance.
I'll take that.
But I think we may have to consider breaking it down into crazy things we can do with the built-in types as compared to what we expect all custom resources to do. Because
Right.
custom resources are slightly more constrained.
Oh. So for the simply implementation, is it we just explicitly set whether this resource should be a kind of merge or replace? In that you basically you can say that with a secret you want to replace it for something.
So server-side apply did try to do that. I think that's what Valerie was hinting at. Right, Valerie?
Yeah, I had a few ideas of how to handle, I mean, the immutability and the fields that get set server-side are fairly different cases. I had a few ideas as to how to handle the server-side fields one, but immutability, I'm not sure of a great solution for.
Okay. Do you think this is in a spot where, like you had said that right now it just takes a bunch of YAML or from a source? Are you open to trying to have people see if they can wire it up into an API resource?
Sure. There's one thing though, I haven't had time to implement it, but Paul suggested specifically moving to something slightly more sophisticated where there's at least like, here's your bundle of YAML, and then here's the history of everything you need to confirm you've garbage collected. So it does make the API more complicated because then you have to specify you've garbage collected something. But right now, the way it does GC is it basically dynamically pulls in every single resource in the entire cluster, tries to figure out what to delete, which is not great. Plus, this would mean that you can have multiple inventory sources rather than having to like get your whole state of the world in one big bundle.
Yeah, that's...
So what ideally I'd want to try to change that before getting people to wire stuff up.
Okay. That makes sense. That may end up evolving a couple times.
Yeah.
Because that is sort of an interesting case of like, I have to, in order to delete things, I have to know what I created. Do I have an anchor resource? Is it a different resource? Is it a config map? Like it's...
What do you mean by an anchor resource?
Oh, so we encounter similar intent kind of problems in narrower cases where like we're trying to create specific resources, and what we do is we create a resource that says like, this is the set of things I created for revision 6, and I'm first going to create a config map that I call anchor, and then everything else is created with an owner ref pointing back to the anchor. And it does two things, right? It gives you a simple spot for cleanup because you can just delete the one config map. Obviously, this is narrower than your case. It only works in a single namespace, but you can delete the single resource and everything else sort of chains off of it and gets deleted. And it gives you the ability to diff between like revision 5 and revision 6, because you can say, you know, what did I have before? And this is what I have now. It's not necessary for a prototype, but it is the sort of thing we tried before.
I could see an approach like that being a workable next step. My own gut feeling when we were talking about this, Valerie, was that that information might eventually be something we'd want to like store in an API, like in the status of the resource that gave us in its spec the manifest or manifest to use. David, do you think would a similar, well, the GC part wouldn't work, but for cluster scope resources, I imagine we could use a config map to hold state instead of relying on GC.
I think you want GC for some aspects of it, and then some it becomes like having a single place to look first rather than, like as Valerie said, she scanned the whole cluster, which is what GC does today to be able to like backtrace the links, but it's expensive to do. I wouldn't rule out anything that tried to invert that mapping without trying it first, right? A separate resource, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Status on the resource, maybe, depends on like how narrow we can get the scope. Um, I don't think that either is super expensive to try.
Yeah. That seems like the meta point here of like some at least slightly more efficient GC as a good next step.
Mhm.
Did you have any other like goals for a next iteration of hacking?
The GC should probably come first, but I wanted to try to throw some spaghetti at the wall over how to handle the intent problem. I had a few ideas, like maybe making the user mock out fields that should be ignored cluster side, or trying to track more delta information to see if like a missing field is meaningful or not. But that's something that concerns me quite quickly for usability, is if like services and deployments and so on start getting whacked in the reconciliation process. So
do you want to go deep on deployments maybe? That's one that like actually came up for us last week.
Sure. This is a design that really bothers me in general. The nature of like the scale resource being something that's in an object versus a pointer outwards, because anything that updates that deployment then whacks down the deployment number.
Yeah.
And then an HPA like comes along a couple seconds later or whatever and brings it back up, but you get some thrash. And lots of people hit this, like people hit this in their deploy pipelines all the time.
Yeah. So we encountered two different sets of intent when we were developing it, right? Remember, so I said Jordan and I, we came to the conclusion that we were going to have to bake in knowledge of certain resources because they behave in odd ways. And deployments came up as one we were going to commonly use. And we came up with two cases in which you need to actually stomp in what a user wants. And those cases are either the user's intent has changed, and this is the easy one, right? This is the one where you can look and say, the user gave me a deployment, and he gave me like the pieces he cared about. So he gave me most of the pod template spec. Maybe he gave me a replicas, maybe he didn't. Maybe he just left it empty for like just a default of 1, and figuring it an HPA would scale it sometime later. But he's changed his argument to add logging, or he's done something for his image. And to determine that, you can actually hash what the user gives you, because he should be giving you stable input, right? We require that for other API interactions. So you get the stable input, you hash it, and then you can put that into an annotation. This is very similar to what you'll see like the with hash stuff in Kube control, right? And so you can figure out whether that changed. And then you have to know whether some other actor in the system changed your deployments in a meaningful way, and you need to stomp it back. This is the case where like you want your source of truth to be this external thing setting YAML, but a naughty cluster admin or someone who just wasn't thinking came in and tried to change the image, and you need to make sure you change it back. And to do that, for deployments, we had the generation field. And so what we did is we tracked both of these pieces of information. Generation, we tracked in a separate object. We're thinking about whether we can make that better or not. And so when generation changes, you can look and then go and apply the user spec again, what the user described, and many times it will apply and be 0 diff off of the update. And so it's 0 diff when a field the user didn't specify has changed, leading to the generation, or if, say, some naughty person changes the default and you do a get, your intent hasn't changed.
I think that hits an important scope question, which is what we want the scope of reconciliation to be, because as you're kind of getting at, there's a lot of fields where they might not be part of the user's intent. Do we assume that having them empty is the user's intent, or do we treat that as fair game for any state? It's kind of why I was thinking about the possibility of, as ugly as it be, blocking out explicit fields on the user intent side of this can be anything, and assuming everything else needs to be reconciled.
So what we had assumed is that it didn't change the generation of the field. So for example, you come in and you specify, I don't know, 6 fields on a deployment or something. There was a new field added about 3 releases ago, and it had a default value associated with it. Now, when you have an old YAML, you definitely won't have that default value in it, right? There won't be anything for that field. And so your input and your output, they never match, right? You put in something, you create it, you get back a different something. And that's what the generation gives you. It says, I created it like this, or I updated it and I didn't specify any of these fields. When I updated, I cleared all these fields. And if they get set by some other actor that doesn't change the generation. Is the goal there? Like, so that means that like when you go and you create or you give an update via admission, they all set the default values, and they all get a value, but the generation that you get back is safe until something else happens.
Okay, sounds like I might need to look a little bit more at the logistics of generation.
It's really nice when it works for you. It's less nice when it doesn't.
I think it would be useful to document these things as we're going.
Okay.
Because in order to use whatever future facility comes out of this, these will be things that you have to understand in all likelihood. So
that's probably true.
Yeah,
it's probably worth just keeping a laundry list as we go.
Yeah, I want to try to make sure that something that actually would be considered GA-able has the fewest sharp edges possible, even if it's not the most elegant, but I'm sure there's going to be some weird cases with any possible solution.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we did find that, and as I said, like we do have some special cases, like secrets, for instance, have special cases around how you handle a type field. But we hadn't gone as detailed as can we classify these into, like, do they affect CRDs? CRDs have limitations that the built-in resources don't, for good or for ill.
Well, I'm not sure that, I don't think we can rule out field immutability for CRDs, right? You could have an admission webhook that prevented a field from being mutable after it's set.
I hadn't thought about that.
Bam.
Devious Paul.
User's gonna use, man. What can I say?
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Is there anything else that people think would be important to try to tackle as far as next stage of prototyping?
I'm curious.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, I'm curious how you would actually differentiate in practice between, like, let's say, different kinds of in-cluster mutations. So HPA is a clear case that you probably don't want to undo what HPA has done when you're rolling out a new version. The naughty cluster admin who changed something they shouldn't have, you clearly do want to use it as kind of a get out of jail reset when you do another push. But what about, like, if there is per cluster config, like maybe that needs to be something that's kind of tunable, like, because sometimes you might want to like do force reconcile basically to set back to a known clean state because something's gone wrong, right? But other times you want to make sure that anything that some other actor in the cluster hasn't you may not always want to reset given state.
Yeah, I was hoping that whatever would emerge would make it easy enough that, like, general cluster administration could happen on the source of truth, and we just have the specific weird cases like replica scale left over. But that kind of thing is why I kept circling back mentally to the idea of like the intent explicitly saying this field can be whatever, because I'm having trouble coming up with a generic solution that doesn't have many negative side effects around trying to guess the user's intent otherwise. Because it feels like the, unless we explicitly bake in knowledge around every use case like that, I don't see a strong difference between like this replica got changed automatically versus like someone naughty added in a new role to the cluster call.
Right. Or some other custom controller that I can't think of an example on the top of my head, but it does similar automated actions like HPA.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no solution that's going to work that doesn't involve the user tagging what they do and don't want to be carried through, because any combination, common usage pattern we come up with, somebody's going to be like, yeah, that's exactly me, except for these two fields.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of a similar point that Josh has made. Like, say that we had really good heuristics around of the type universe that's known to us, which require what kind of special handling. If I add a new type to that universe via CRD and like have my own, validation webhook that introduces a set once constraint or immutability or whatever to a particular field, probably I'm going to have to have some mechanism to make to express that. I'm not sure if I think that should be in the resource itself. Like, I'm not sure if an annotation would be the right way to express it. Like, in general, I think one thing to optimize for in a future API is like lowest possible additional work that you have to do to distribute a manifest. But perhaps there's like a control plane level thing that would be a way to approach it, of saying, here are the like JSON path expressions of particular fields that have these behaviors that like you wouldn't have a built-in heuristic for.
There is that. I think I could also see a case to be made that says if this resource is the source of truth, the source of my YAML manifest that I want to apply, if that is the source of truth, how much mileage can we get by saying it's the source of truth? That's what it is. If a cluster admin wants to make a change in one cluster, well, I think what we described is that we have a bag of YAML, a set of manifests for apply. The cluster admin changes it there and it gets applied. And if it's slightly different per cluster, then that seems like the sort of thing where you would build a layer on top. You build on top of this building piece, this building block that says, I have these things, this is exactly what I want in this cluster. And then something else that would manage things like templatizing per cluster might give you more use.
Yeah, so the API is deliberately meant to be as minimal as possible for the inventory right now, because people can build whatever longer term, like for what I've whiteboarded around what it would look like, localization is definitely a part of it. Ideally, it's just the automation that is the special case rather than generic administer BF.
Right.
So to play what you just articulated forward an example, David, with a deployment, say I have a deployment that's going to be scaled by HPA. In the manifest that I deploy, I can leave replicas out of that and just write the information on the HPA and rely on HPA completely governing that field.
That's what we tried to do. Now, it seems to work, but I haven't tried it in the same level of scope that I think Valerie is looking for deployments in, right? We've been using it in a fairly constrained way.
I mean, we could make it very clear with documentation and like as many helper hints as possible of, hey, you probably shouldn't do this, but I would need to think and see if there's a case that would violate that where like the user would want to set it, but it's also dynamic in some way.
Also, like that seems like it seems like a good way to start. Just like leave it out and see if that works. And then maybe you only need to go a little bit further. And Paul, your example of like an annotation with the JSON path, maybe it's just specifying a subset of fields that are write only on create, so they're ignored on update. So a way that you could set some kind of default and see if that helps close any gaps.
Yeah. I guess another approach could be if you have like heuristics defined for certain fields, you could write a warning into the status of like whatever API holds the spec that has the manifests in them. You could write into the status that like, hey, this JSON path expression like resolves to a field that like is known to be problematic when you set it in this way. So you may want to consider whether that's the actual intent that you have, or maybe you didn't mean to set it.
The notion though of you set it only on write, but you ignore updates. As soon as you start to think about replica counts, you may also really want to think about ranges as well. So I'm going to set it once to a default value of 3. HPA may move it up or down. HPA may have its own notion of policy. If HPA is, I guess, also governed, you could do min and max there. But I kind of wonder, do you actually end up adding conditions that only write this field, don't worry about updates, but maintain this invariant of greater than, less than, etc.?
I don't think that we want to try to program predicate logic, at least in terms of like a first blush what we're talking about here to start.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably not the right solution, both in terms of complexity and inability to generalize it.
Valerie, you brought up I think already the flapping. Like if you had your cluster reconciler clamping HPA back down and it kept trying to scale back up.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good example of the case for like clear user knowledge and warnings, because like every other person has this problem.
Yeah.
It might be interesting to like once we're a little further along in hacking to just see what types of scenarios we can construct that like demonstrate flapping type behaviors or unintended consequences of X or Y thing in a manifest. And at least catalog them and see like of the known examples that we can reliably construct where this happens, what's the best thing that you would be able to do for a user?
Yeah, I think that's a good plan. Now that we have like a generic hello world of reconciliation, it's probably time to think about the nastiest cases we can throw at it and what the best resolution should be.
So what happens when a manifest example ultimately ends up creating other kinds? Would you simply track that through owner references to those kinds? So if I had in a manifest a description of a PVC, the PV gets created on the remote cluster, or I have a CRD that ultimately creates other resources.
I think the way to handle that.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, sorry, finish your question.
That was it. Just, I think I'm trying to reason through, okay, we're talking about changes to attributes on an object that it has a one-to-one correspondence to the manifest. What happens when you've got generated objects that are related to the manifest but are not generated one-for-one to it?
So are these being generated in the cluster, right?
Correct.
I think the way to handle
like a
that.
dynamic provisioner.
I think the reconcilers shouldn't track child objects. Cleaning up those should be the result of like standard finalizers and garbage collection.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm +1 on that.
Okay.
Yeah, internally, this was one of our use cases around like having a Lyft app type CRD that then spits out all its child resources. And ideally, we don't want to have to think about those at the reconciler scope.
Okay.
I've got to run soon. Anything else I can address while I'm here?
I think I probably just want to make sure that we understand next steps you're going to take. And when do you want to talk about it again?
More than 2 weeks might be beneficial because stuff is kind of crazy right now, so my availability varies. Next step, I think, is changing the garbage collection story, documenting some of the like nastier edge cases that this hits right now, and coming up with ideas, if not implementations, around what the concrete behavior should be.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I think in order for us to have easiest lab-like experience, maybe one additional next step beyond those is put like a minimal API that would feed the reconciler that doesn't
Yeah.
have any scheduling, no registration or anything, just source of truth.
Yeah, I can do that.
Sounds pretty cool to me. Thanks for putting the prototype together.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the input.
Yeah. If we're interested in opening PRs, is that something you're okay with?
Go for it. I mean, it's all pretty unstable and in flux at this stage, but
yeah, no one's getting attached to anything. Just looking at it.
yeah. Also, like, let me know if you're going to do something so I don't accidentally try to jam up a whole conflicting version the same day.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Sounds like we're talked through for the main agenda item. So Jeremy, you're on. Did you want to have another session in next week's meeting on any of the multi-cluster service stuff?
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I'm kind of incorporating some of the comments on the CAT PR to kind of flesh it out a little bit more. So that would probably be worth doing. I don't know that it needs to necessarily be as long as last time, but there are definitely still some open questions. So that sounds worth it. And then I guess what's the process for getting the CAP merged and getting that started, at least as a draft?
That's a good question. I'll be honest, it's been ages since I worked on a CAP or proposal in KK. David, Tim, do you have any perspective on like what the right point is to get something to in CAP form before it gets merged?
I think there needs to be time to review. There's been plenty of time for this. I would say that as long as it's provisional and no one has objected, give it enough time to review. If someone who is an owner in there, like, is that you or Tim? It's been brought up multiple times. I don't see significant barriers to it unless I haven't looked at it in detail. So I don't know if something's come up. Tim?
No, I don't think, you think you're right. I don't think anything's come up in particular. I haven't read the text of the CAP this week, but I assume it's not largely different than the docs that preceded it. So the question, I guess, is provisional versus implementable. This is something of an experiment still,
Yeah.
I think. And so the question is, like, do we leave it in provisional and go off and try to implement experiments, or do we move it to implementable with the caveat that this is, the first version of the ideas or second draft or whatever we think it is actually. I'm not sure there's actually a ton of precedent for KEPs describing things that we're really not sure about.
Yeah. My gut
I think it's fine
would
anyway,
be,
honestly.
Yeah, my gut would be I'd like it not to linger as a PR. I expect that we will probably refine the content of the KEP. Think probably that means let's leave it as provisional. We can go do some hacking around it, see if we think like the concepts are durable in that hacking, or if we discover any gotchas, and then assess what to do next.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, well, I will write you into the agenda for next week, Jeremy, and if anybody else has agenda items they want to put, it's world writable. So just add your item, and see you next week, same time.
Great. Thank you.
Sounds good.
All right. See you, everybody.
Thanks.
See ya.